Already acclaimed in boardrooms the world over, How the Deal Was Done brings together the most interesting and candid deal makers in investment history. With your host, Laura Queen, founder and CEO of 29 Bison. And now, How the Deal Was Done.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us. I'm Laura Queen, founder and CEO of 29 Bison, human capital advisors to the middle market. Our guest for this episode of How the Deal Was Done is Joe Feldman, president of Joseph Feldman Associates, an acquisitions and strategic consulting firm near Chicago. When was the last time you engaged in role-playing as part of the deal-making process? In this episode, Joe shares how asking the question, what if, and adopting the perspectives of each party to a transaction can positively inform your approach to deal-making. His story illustrates the importance of clarifying language, asking the right questions, looking at things from another's vantage point, and effectively communicating at every stage of a deal. If you like what you hear, please share this episode with others. Like and follow us on this channel and our social media outlets, including LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. If you're curious about us, we can be found at 29bison.com. That's 29bison.com. Thank you again for being with us. Find a quiet corner, turn up the volume, sit back, and enjoy. Joe, welcome to this episode of How the Deal Was Done. Thank you so much for being our participant today.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here.
Terrific. To begin our conversation, Joe, would you mind sharing with our audience a bit about your personal professional background, how you get to the place you're in right now, and what inspires you about deal making?
Sure. So thanks again for the opportunity. I spent the first part of my career in a large corporate setting, working for Searle Pharmaceuticals, the NutraSweet company, and then Monsanto. And I worked through a series of functional areas, starting with financial planning and analysis, R&D operations, international operations, including a 2-year stint in Switzerland, which was fantastic. And then the last half of my career was in a series of business development and corporate development roles in the food ingredient business, in ag biotech, and in pharmaceuticals. I left the company after an acquisition would have required me to move to the East Coast, which wasn't attractive to me at the time. And I worked for 3 successive venture stage firms, an ag biotech firm, a pharmaceutical informatics firm, and then I was co-founder of a venture capital and incubation company. And it was through the course of that big company experience and I'll say scrappy early stage experience that I had occasion to put my shingle out as a consultant focused on growth strategies and acquisitions. And I'm now 12 years into Joseph Feldman Associates corporate development consultant.
And Joe, tell us, as a consultant, what is it that you love about the work you do? What inspires you every day to get up and continue doing it?
So there are 2 things that jump to mind. One is I am very fortunate to be able to work with a lot of smart, clever, aspirational people. And while you don't always get to pick your clients as a general rule, that's a luxury that I have found myself able to take advantage of. So that's number one. And the second is I love the problem-solving aspect of deal making. And by problem solving, I mean when 2 organizations are in a conversation or in a dialogue, you could say courting one another around what might turn into an acquisition transaction or other kind of strategic relationship, by the way. The question is, are the 2 sides going to find common ground? And I see that as far more than just a negotiation. I see that as it's a people challenge. It's a valuation and shared values opportunity or not. It's a question of will the two sides and very often the many people on each of the 2 sides see the opportunity in a sufficiently overlapping way that they can come together. And I think sort of to me, what ties it up in a bow and what is, I think, the most fun is figuring out and thinking about the sequencing of how to manage the conversations, how to think about the analyses that ultimately will lead to the handshake and the closing of a transaction, and then realization of the opportunity that the two sides had in mind. I had the opportunity years ago to work with a deal attorney on the West Coast, and he said, if you can figure out the sequencing that's appropriate for any given transaction, you're far more than halfway there. That the pieces of the puzzle with regard to deal terms and conditions and reaching a meeting of the minds will really fall out of that detailed look at what is the right sequencing for whatever role you have in trying to move a deal forward.
That's a wise observation, that's for sure.
Yeah, I'd love to tell you that I thought of it myself, but it was this West Coast attorney who put it out there, and he would start and end every conversation with the question: Have we thought about the sequencing of this? Is there a different order in which we might put the issues on the table, or different conversations we might have with some people, but maybe not others, that would improve the likely our likely success in accomplishing what we're trying to accomplish?
I had a tremendous mentor years ago who used to say, when people present great pieces of wisdom, steal shamelessly. And he was so right.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's one that is ripe for a lot of people to apply. And I'd welcome anyone to take the idea and syndicate it the way I've and benefit from it the way I have. So absolutely carry on there.
That's great. So, Joe, I imagine that in your career, a dozen years or so in your own consulting business, and certainly the deal-making experiences you have prior, you've had your fair share of stories to tell. We'd love to hear from you some of the more memorable ones.
Sure. Well, one that jumps to mind for me is having, I'll say, a lot of lessons and that are, I think, applicable to different people who are involved in deals, particularly, I'd say, in the middle market and in instances where the seller may not have as much experience with deal making as the buyer. I think that covers a wide swath of potential transactions. This was a case where I was working with a client. They were an industrial products supplier. It was a company, a substantial company. They had a very wide range of products and related services. They had some of their products were sold, I'll say, off the shelf. Others had a lot of customer specific value add associated with them, either in the form of services or special combinations of their existing products. They'd had a track record of opening new markets and bringing products out of their internal new product development capability. And from time to time, they had done acquisitions, but it hadn't been a deliberate, ongoing effort. It had been, I would say, rather opportunistic. So, that they'd meet an organization that had a product or some kind of technology that was complementary to their own. They might have a conversation and see if they could put a deal together. But they had at that point decided that they needed to be a little bit more deliberate and to more aggressively try to identify potential opportunities that might fit, so that they could evaluate different ways in which their competition might be gaining on them in certain markets or taking some of their customers, and how they might be able to staunch that sort of erosion of a competitive position by adding on through acquisitions more deliberately. So they asked me if I would come in and essentially help them to jumpstart their deal flow. They had contacts in the industry that were relevant, but they didn't. At the end of the day, they didn't have an executive who was on team as a you could say, as a VP of corporate development. And so they asked if I would come in and essentially play that role to jumpstart their effort.
And Joe, in this circumstance, what were the things they were looking at specifically with respect to the competition? Were there areas that they knew where their business was going to be eroding, or were they simply in a circumstance where they knew they were losing business and had to do something?
So the marketplace that they were operating in, and for confidentiality reasons, I can't go into all the details. There were a lot of innovators who had established niche products that were very well received by the customers in that in their sector, and so that created I'll say a gap between the customers who had looked to my client as the expert, the source of value and support, and my client was finding that customers were saying, well, now I really need to look beyond my usual vendors or suppliers, even those that they had considered to be strategic. I probably have to look beyond that. And there was a fair amount of acquisition activity and I'll say strategic partnering, so distribution relationships, shared sourcing relationships, and the like for certain components that were difficult to get. And so my client saw not necessarily active erosion. The business was not in a crisis by any stretch, but they saw that if they relied solely on their internal new product development capability, that there was a more than nominal risk that competitors would buy up some of these scrappy startups that they were seeing, or companies that had been around a long time but had developed a particular mix of capabilities and expertise, particularly around customization for customers, and that my client might be in essence left behind. So that's really what they what they were looking to do is to proactively be in front of potential targets, and having the conversation with those companies to say, are there things that we can be doing to work together, whether it's a distribution arrangement, it could be an acquisition, or maybe it's an investment, and to, I'll say, burden themselves with some knowledge about what's going on in the market. And so that's really what they wanted to have me help jumpstart.
And how did you go about the process of helping narrow down the most pertinent or salient opportunities for this client?
Well, so the project started off just as I've described it, looking for new products in certain that were responsive to certain segments that they were selling into. So it was either technologies or products that would sell into multiple segments, or in certain cases, based on what they knew about some segments, being able to go very deep and look for products and opportunities that were of particular value. So the initial work was an effort to connect with organizations like that through trade shows, through specialty, I would say, niche investment bankers or business brokers. To some extent, it was leveraging the executives in the organization that had roles that involved a lot of contacts in the industry, and that's the path we headed down, and we started to be able to have those conversations with companies that were interested in discussing ways that they might have their growth accelerated, either by, as I mentioned, by distribution agreements or maybe by acquisition. The story that I think is most interesting about this was from a bit of a surprise along the way. So we were going down that path that I described, and I was in my client's office, and the CEO grabbed me and said, "Hey, I need your advice on something. Can you take a look at this letter of intent that we just submitted?" It's for a business that we've been familiar with, and we've had a relationship with the owner slash CEO for quite some time. And we put a letter of intent in front of him. We were very hopeful that we had a proposition that was going to be interesting, and we'd be able to move finally from this sort of long, drawn-out courting process to an acquisition that it would take the relationship to the next level. And it was very clear that the distribution and sort of collaborative but short of acquisition way that the two companies had been working together was sort of interesting but just suboptimal. So he said, "Can you look at this letter of intent, and tell me what you think of it? Tell me if there's something that you would do differently, because somehow we've missed it." So it was kind of an interesting request, because I would have been not the second person to look at this letter of intent. There's a lot of people whose eyes had been on it. So I took a look at it, and it had, I'll say, all the usual things that you'd expect to see. There was a price. There was a discussion about the diligence that remained to be done before the transaction would close. There was some discussion about what role the CEO would have on a transition basis after the deal was closed. Sort of all the predictable things that you'd expect in a letter of intent. The other thing I saw was that letter of intent had more, I'll say, deal jargon and more references to numbers than I would have done had I drafted the original LOI. And they had a lot of terminology, and I remember being struck by the fact that they used a variety of different terms that were not synonyms, but they might have appeared to be synonyms to the seller or to the would-be seller. They had, in the same letter of intent, they referred to assets, net current assets, and net working capital. And so the opportunity for not only misunderstanding, but just I would say bafflement, I'd say was pretty high. And it wasn't that this whoever had their hands in the letter of intent had written something. I'm making it sound like it was probably more disastrous than it really was, but it was hard to follow. I think that's a safe statement to make. And I kept thinking, okay, so I don't know this seller, but what I do know is this is an entrepreneur, started the company, many years previous, had built it up to be a pretty substantial level, but he had no deal experience. That wasn't his world. So he was engaging in his first sale of business. By the way, it was going to be his only sale of a business. He'd always been on his own as a scrappy entrepreneur. So he didn't bring any, I'll say, big company deal experience to, his world of entrepreneurship. So I look at it and I thought, if I'm him, I probably understand very clearly, what's my transition role? How are they going to take the team that I've put together and treat them afterwards, which was something that was very important to him. It was important to the buyer too. But I looked at it and I thought, there's no way he can look at this and figure out how much money he's going to have at the end of the transaction. It's just, it's too hard to follow. So the CEO said, so what do you think? And I said, I think I need to talk to, I need to talk to this owner. And if we can get him on the phone, I think maybe if I can just, ask him a few questions, might be able to give you some more concrete feedback. So he said, sure, let's organize that. And I think later that afternoon, we had a conference call, and there were essentially, it all boiled down to two questions that I had to sort of suss out. One was, how much does this seller want for his business? And just how far apart were we really? So I listened to, I was introduced as this corporate development helper, and I started to ask him questions about, what did he What did he think? What were his main priorities? What are the things that he was concerned about? I was asking him first about very qualitative aspects of the transaction, and it was pretty clear that the qualitative side was all fine. At least I couldn't find any big red flags that suggested that the two sides were far off. And then we started to talk about the dollar amount, and it was pretty clear that he just felt like it just wasn't high enough. It just wasn't, what he thought the business was worth. And he had gone out of his way to say, I'm not trying to, sell this business for more than it's worth, but I want to get fair value for it. And here's why I think, the letter of intent just doesn't measure up. And so at that point I asked him a question that my client had never thought to ask him, which was, so after the transaction's done, how much cash do you want to have? What's your number? And my client's sitting across the table. We're on this conference call, and my client's looking at me like I'm crazy for asking this question. And I was thinking, I only know how to get the answer to this question clearest by just asking the guy,
right?
So how much do you need? And he was ready to make it easy for me. He said, well, here's what I think. I need X millions of dollars when everything is said and done. I said, okay, so tell me what is it when you say when everything's said and done, what does that mean? And he said, well, I'm going to have to pay tax on the gain of this, selling this business that I started, with nothing. So it's going to be all capital gains, but there's going to be some tax. And I have an employee incentive program that you may or may not have seen, but I've told, members of my executive team that, at such time as there was a transaction that I was going to share, a part of the proceeds with them. So that's a deduct. And he had a couple of other points that there were a couple of significant expenses that were coming due that it wasn't clear. They were, I'll say, related party transactions involving, I think it may have been some real estate, like a rent payment. And he said, I just need to know that, certain payments are going to be made either before or after the transaction, so that net I know what I'm going to get. And so I asked a few more questions, sort of in the fashion of Columbo from the TV show long ago. Of let me, it's like, thank you very much, and oh, by the way, let me ask you just one more clarifying question. So we finished up, and I got off the phone, and my client was, first of all, sort of, I'll say, surprised a little bit and maybe even bewildered that, that I had asked the question, and B, that this guy answered it. He just answered it flat out. He gave us the roadmap. And so I went back to my Excel spreadsheet, and I, looked, I put together a listing of what the top line would be, what the deducts would be as he explained it to me. What I didn't know what his tax bracket would be precisely, but I could guess, and probably not be too far off, and come up with a number that would meet his expectations. And so I went back to my client and said, here's what we have to go back and offer him to get this deal and to meet the number that he just told us. And I think we can do it. And they said, well, is this going to cost us a lot more? And I said, no, it's actually going to cost you exactly, pretty much exactly what you have here. Might have even been slightly less. But because they had been miscommunicating with each other, or let's say failing to communicate, talking past each other,
right.
What was offered and sort of what was said and what was heard were far enough apart that they couldn't see that they were actually, in danger of agreeing with one another. but the communication had been so, I'll say, stilted by, an overly complex, jargon-laden LOI, and someone on the receiving end who didn't have the experience to sort out what those deal terms meant for them. And the guy had an advisor, but it was an advisor who was, I think it was, I can't remember now, it was either a longstanding accountant or lawyer, but it was not someone who had lots of deal experience either. It was the trusted advisor this guy really wanted. So the good news is I was able to redraft the deal points into a very simple, not even letter of intent, but just I would call it a term sheet, I guess. And I called the guy up the next day and said, here's how I'm going to get your number. We're going to pay you X dollars for the business at closing. You told me that a certain number of dollars are going to go to your management team. Here's how these other payments that you were concerned about are going to be handled. I'm guessing your taxes are in the range of such and such. And so when all is said and done, here's the cash that you're going to be able to take to the bank. And he asked me to send it to him in writing, which I had been ready to do. And the next morning he called me and said, "We've got a deal."
Fantastic. That's great. Joe, it really points to how important asking the right questions is. It elicits a set of interesting and important responses on both sides, on both the sellers and the buyer side. And it really helps to ward off the opportunity for misinterpretation, misperception, and potentially, either blowing up a deal or going down the wrong path with the deal, doesn't it?
Right. I mean, I think the notion, or let's say the way some people characterize or think about negotiations is in such an adversarial, has such an adversarial feel to it. Of we're gonna put our fists on the table. We're gonna we may have to concede a point here and there. And there are transactions that probably get done on that basis alone. But I would say in the vast majority of deals that I've been involved in, if that's part of the deal process, if that's part of the negotiation process, it's I'll say the last little bit, which is not insignificant, but you don't even get to have those last few sort of trade-off conversations if you don't have the meeting of the mind, long before, the purchase agreement is being wrestled over.
Right. Yeah, I will say from our experience, we have had circumstances where a would-be seller either hasn't contemplated what they really want out of a potential deal, or they're reluctant to put their want on the table. And it's such a critical piece of putting this entire puzzle, solving this puzzle together. So we always recommend to our clients as they go through this process to get as clear as you possibly can about what your ideal ask would be. What is your guidance or advice for buyers in this same circumstance?
Right. So I think, to me, a couple of take homes. One is that deals are hard enough, and the negotiating process is hard enough, and you certainly can't walk in on the first day and say, tell me what your bottom line is, and expect to hear back something that is truly the bottom line and truly actionable. But you can, right from the get-go, be mindful of where communication breakdowns might happen. Where there can be misunderstandings based on, I'll say, a language difference. That could be literally a language difference in the case of cross-border transactions. It can be a language difference when you've got two companies that are dealing with different parts of a supply chain. maybe one is a more technology-oriented company, the other is a more sales-oriented company, and so the words they use to describe sales and marketing and the roles that they have, or even the way their financial statements are constructed, could be quite different. So staying mindful of where can communication break down. Another is just being very aware of the relative experience of the folks that are on the other side of the negotiating table. That's not to say that someone that's never done a deal before can't do a deal today or can't get advice, but there is a certain level of anxiety that I think is natural for an entrepreneur selling his or her company for the one and only time. And so being mindful and respectful of that, and appreciating that, some of the things that are routine for people that are, whose livelihoods involve buying and selling companies. That's an imbalance that it's really important to be mindful of.
What a critical piece of information. I think true for all of us in that transaction space, whether we are there as consultants and advisors, as trusted friends and colleagues, or as, parties to the transaction, recognizing that there are opportunities for us to educate as part of this process so that at the end, we're all better for having the transaction, both in a material way, but also in terms of our own personal and professional learning. That's a great piece of advice. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, I think another, maybe another, maybe a last, piece of learning that I've really embraced is being comfortable at the right time in a negotiation, being comfortable asking some version of a what if question. So there's certainly some good research, academic research related to negotiation strategies that use this concept. And the idea is, as you're getting closer to an agreement, to have the confidence, but also there's a certain, personal way of communicating it, to be able to say, so what if instead of the path that we've gone down, where we're going to pay X millions of dollars and we're going to have maybe it's an earnout, or maybe it's some sort of performance payments. What if instead we did something else? What about that would you like or dislike? Or what if we, instead of doing this transaction the way we've talked about, what if you retained an equity stake that's larger than you had contemplated, or maybe retaining one where you didn't contemplate that at all? So it's not trying to renegotiate the deal, but it's trying to explore in a very explicit way, different trade-offs that the other side might want to think about. A different version of that I think could be helpful for one side preparing for a discussion with the other is to use role playing, where that sort of question could be asked, where two members of the same side of the negotiating team can take turns playing the role of the buyer and of the seller, and trying to play out, well, what if we said that, and they, how might they react? And then let's try 3 or 4 different ways that they might react that maybe would cause us to think about, a different way of doing the deal, or a different way of structuring it, or maybe a different way of setting up the what if question. Those sorts of role-playing scenarios are ones that I would say in my career have found to be really uncomfortable at the beginning, when it's not a tool that a working group is accustomed to. But once you get accustomed to it, it can become incredibly powerful to sort of at a moment's notice in a discussion that you're having about how to prepare for a negotiation or some critical meeting to just jump into role playing, to try ideas on for size, and think about what happens if the other side is extraordinarily objects in some significant way or says something that just seems completely crazy. How will we react? That sort of preparation, I think, can be invaluable.
Yeah, there's so much benefit to that other-mindedness, taking on someone else's perspective, both in terms of empathizing with who they are and their position in the circumstance, but also in terms of being able to respond in time or real time when a situation comes up. You've anticipated to some degree what the other person's perspective might be, and you can respond perhaps more cogently or with, again, a greater level of empathy, or even with a particular answer because you've been able to conceptualize what it might look and feel like.
Right. In my experience, there's a big difference between let's think of the different ways they might respond versus let's role play it, and we're going to take turns actually saying those different things and then being in a position to actually have to have a conversation. It's very different from, oh yeah, we'll handle that. If that comes up, don't worry, we'll handle it. It's like, okay, well, what would you say? What would you say?
Yeah, how would you approach it? Right. The great point of clarification. Joe, this has been really a wonderful conversation. I've enjoyed hearing this specific story, and I imagine that there are lots and lots of others in your background that could be shared, and we look forward to hearing some of those in another episode. Would you take a moment and oh, you're welcome. Would you take a moment and share with the audience a bit about your professional services firm and how people can get in touch with you?
Sure, by all means. So my company is called Joseph Feldman Associates, and I can be contacted at JF, my initials, Joseph Feldman, so JF at josephfeldman.com. My direct number is 312-961-2099. I work in suburban Chicago. My business is almost entirely buy-side acquisition and other sort of strategic transactions. Most of my clients are middle market companies, which would, in my case, suggest revenues in the range of 25 million to maybe $1 billion. Most of my clients are private equity owned. I have done work for public companies, family-owned businesses, ESOPs, and professional service companies. I work on a project basis, and that can be as essentially an outsourced VP of corporate development, or it can be as a non-disclosed consultant where I'm making inquiries on behalf of the company on a blinded basis. I've done work across the board in the corporate development world with deal sourcing, negotiation support, diligence management, valuation, and all the sorts of activities that an executive would do if a company had such an executive on their team. But typically my clients don't, so they look for me to help on a project basis. I've had the pleasure of working across a wide range of industries. About a third of my projects involve some cross-border element, and that can be that comes in a lot of different flavors. But over the years, having done work in cross-border scenarios, I've learned a little bit along the way there, and I'm cautious about extrapolating too much. But I've also come to recognize that having some cross-border experience turns out to be extraordinarily important in many circumstances. I would certainly welcome inquiries on an exploratory basis, or if folks wanted to visit my website, josephfeldman.com. There's some information there about my services, as well as a range of different articles that I've written specifically around companies finding different ways of improving their odds of success with acquisitions.
That's terrific. Thanks. So it has been such a pleasure again having you join us for today's episode. We wish you tremendous success, and we look forward to having another conversation with you at some time in the future.
Laura, thank you so very much. I appreciate this opportunity and have a great day.
Our pleasure.